Good morning. Judge Tom Petersen from Miami, Florida is with us, and we're talking about the justice system, juvenile probation, and justice. Tom, when did the progressive era begin to really address the differences between adults and juveniles in both the probation systems and justice systems?
Until that era in the beginning of the 20th century, which we call the progressive era, juveniles weren't really looked at as a separate group. But along with many other reforms in that progressive period, child labor, minimum wage, things like that, the idea of a juvenile court was kind of an obvious. It was kind of obvious that it wasn't effective or equitable to treat a 14-year-old the same way as you treated a 34-year-old. So the separate juvenile court was established. I think the first one was in Chicago, and it's associated with Jane Addams, as of course, one of the foremost progressive during that era. And so juvenile court started with that intention of helping kids, and that kind of lasted until 1967 with that Supreme Court ruling. The assumption was, oh, juvenile court is a wonderful place. It's there to help kids. It's going to do wonderful things, nice things. It's going to rehabilitate kids, which is one. The word rehabilitate it turns out to be kind of symbolic of one of the big issues. Is delinquency a temporary aberration in a kid's life? Is it that a kid gets off of the track and just needs to be rehabilitated, which means that he or she was habilitated and something happened and we just got to kind of adjust the settings a little bit and then put the kid back on track again. So we can rehabilitate a kid, as opposed to the idea that maybe the kid's life was never on what we call the right track, that maybe the kid was growing up in a situation that was an ongoing situation, and you had to change the situation to habilitate the kid rather than rehabilitate someone who had been habilitated and got off the track. But the idea was that we could fix kids fairly easily, and most people have seen or remember. Well, people our age remember Boys Town, the movie, the film with Spencer Tracy playing
Father Flanagan.
Right, and Mickey Rooney playing the delinquent kid who becomes mayor of who goes to Boys Town. Boys Town turns out to be this wonderful place, and Mickey Rooney becomes not only rehabilitated, but he becomes the mayor of Boys Town, and everybody lives happily ever after. And that's what everybody thinks of when they think about juvenile court. The rural setting and the whole idea of Father Flanagan, the whole idea that there are good people who are going to fix kids, it's a nice idea, but it didn't work out terribly well. And in 1963, which was when the Galt case arose, in a Midwestern rural area, same as Boys Town, Father Flanagan arose. And the whole idea, the whole image of juvenile court and delinquent kids, you don't think of inner city urban areas when we think back to the 50s and 40s and 50s, and we think of rural areas and Boys Town, and Gerald Galt was a 15-year-old kid in the Midwest who was charged with making an obscene phone call. And he was arrested without his parents being told about it. He went to court without a lawyer. They had a hearing. The person that he supposedly made the phone call to didn't even appear. So I don't know how they established that. Finally, Gerald Galt's mother showed up and said, well, make the woman come in who said he made the phone call so she can hear his voice. And they wouldn't do that. The judge just said he did it, he's guilty, and send him away for until he was 21. With the juvenile, and again, that idea of rehabilitation dictates that when you sentence a kid to an institution, that you do it for an indefinite period of time, unlike with adults. The penalty for making an obscene phone call for an adult was 60 days in jail. But because Gerald Galt was a 15-year-old, the penalty was, or they don't call it a penalty because he's being helped theoretically. The disposition is that he is sent to a reform school until he's 21, which is 6 years, unless he gets rehabilitated sooner. So instead of getting 60 days, which would have been the penalty for an adult, he got 6 years because he was a juvenile, didn't have a lawyer. The alleged victim never showed up in court. There wasn't much of a hearing. And that's when the Supreme Court said this idea of helping kids can get out of hand, obviously, because the rationale for doing that is, well, it's not a punishment. We're sending him away for 6 years to a reform school to help him. We're all here to help. When this is not a punishment, this is not a criminal proceeding. We're all here to do good things. We're all Father Flanagan. This is Boys Town, and that was the mythology and behind it. And luckily, the Supreme Court, which probably wouldn't happen today, that was the Earl Warren Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that 10 years before that had ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional, and it was a liberal court, and it found that the juveniles had the same right as an adult to have lawyers, and that's where I came in 1967. And when I got there, I did find an institution that was really doing, under the guise of helping kids, was sending them to these horrible places for indefinite periods of time, without really addressing the underlying issues in any way, and that. So from then on, juvenile court changed a lot. Once public offenders and lawyers got there, it made an adjustment, and for the better, because things like the thing that happened to Gerald Galt didn't happen anymore. But juvenile court still, and that's the era in which I was there, before I became a judge in 1990. During that era, well, throughout there's certain things in juvenile court that, for example, a juvenile can't have a jury trial, and there are a lot of differences between the way juveniles are treated and adults are treated. And what I found was the saddest part was that juveniles were being sent to programs and probation. You mentioned juvenile probation, because the options for a juvenile court judge are to place a kid on probation, or to place him in an institution, a residential program, or to send him or her to adult court, which wasn't done very much back then. But the next change in the history of juvenile court after the Galt decision was in the early 90s, when there was a big surge in crime generally. The crack cocaine thing had a lot to do with it, which in the mid 80s. But there was a surge in crime and in delinquency in the early 90s. And juvenile court suddenly changed to become much tougher on crime than it had been before. And state legislatures passed laws giving the prosecutors the right to just take a kid out of juvenile court and put that kid in adult court for various types of crimes. So suddenly juvenile court got tougher because of the war on crime, kind of war on drugs, and all that happened. And that happened in the 90s. along with what was happening in the adult system, which was mass incarceration. The juvenile version of mass incarceration was to take kids out of juvenile court and put them in adult court for things that, in many cases, I didn't think they should be going to adult court for. One example was I remember a kid that he was a 17-year-old kid. 18 in Florida, like as in most states, is the cutoff point between juveniles and adults. And this kid was 17, Hispanic kid, and he was charged with stealing a pizza from the pizza guy, physically taking the pizza, which technically is a robbery, which is forcibly taking something. But he had never been in trouble before, and he was a good kid. I mean, and his parents didn't speak English, and I will never forget them coming to court and crying about their son being locked up for 21 days while they were making a decision, and then on the 21st day, because the state has 21 days to decide if they're going to treat the kid as an adult or send him or keep him in juvenile court or send him to adult court. And they sent him to adult court to be treated as an adult because he was charged with a robbery, even though it was just taking a pizza. So the kid was going to be treated as an adult and not left in juvenile court, where I would have put him in a juvenile program. My contention as a judge was, well, if he got to be 17 and hasn't gotten in trouble, that's a plus. The prosecutor said, no, that's not a plus because it means that he's close to 18, which is all the more reason to take him out of juvenile court and put him in adult court. So you get conflicting takes on what's happening, and their position is a robbery is a robbery. It doesn't matter if you're taking a pizza by grabbing it or taking something by gunpoint. It's a robbery. He's got to go to adult court. And I remember the family coming to court the day that they announced that the state had decided to take him and send him to adult court, and they were crying and looking at me, and I'm the judge, so I'm sitting there with a robe on.
Yes.
And they're looking at me and saying, well, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And I'm telling them, I'm not doing that. I want them to stay here. The prosecutor's doing that, and I have no control over that. And they didn't understand that, obviously, because why would I be sitting there in a black robe if I wasn't have the ultimate say?
Yes.
And I was just as frustrated as they were. And that was happening every day. And suddenly, the decision to take a kid from juvenile court and send him to adult court was taken away from judges and given to prosecutors. So hundreds and hundreds of kids were being sent to adult court each year during the 90s and into the first decade of this century. And I was just frustrated with that. And it's at that point that I had left. I had tried to do what I could do in terms of starting programs and things. But that was, so you have the period of juvenile court history before the Galt decision, which was the Mickey Rooney Boys Town model, where you could just rehabilitate kids if you had a good heart or a priest.
Yes.
Followed by the post-Galt decision, where things got better in terms of the procedures in juvenile court. The programs didn't get any better. And then we got into that get tough part in the early 90s, which was partially based on the fact that everybody recognized that the programs weren't working. So it wasn't just that the kid who stole the pizza was being sent to adult court because he stole a pizza. It was because the options in juvenile court that were suggested weren't working. So the prosecutor's argument was, well, okay, so it's a close call, but juvenile court has nothing to offer. And that's the bind that juvenile court really was in during most of all of its history, and why juvenile court is not looked at today as being a success throughout its history, even though there were ups and downs in that history,
Right.
which is a whole other topic. Why doesn't juvenile court work? Why don't the institutions work? Why doesn't probation work?
Right.
And
And
maybe we want to talk about
Yeah,
about that.
I was just going to ask you, have you, looking around the world, is there any country that has really impressed you? And I have to say this in the context that we understand that the United States is a very heterogeneous, large population. But is there any country in the world that has set up a system that you believe is effective in juvenile probation?
Well, the most effective thing you can do with well, there are. I mean, the statistics are clear that the countries that have a homogeneous population, Japan, Norway, if you have a homogeneous population and a reasonable basic income level, we don't have a lot of poverty, and that whatever you do in juvenile court is going to work. You're not going to have that many kids there. When in juvenile court, when I was there, and today in any big city in the United States, the distribution, the racial, ethnic distribution of kids is always about 60% Black kids, 30% Hispanic kids, and 10% Anglo or white kids.
Right.
So the Mickey Rooneys really aren't very numerous, and what happens in modern urban America, unlike Norway or Japan, where you've got homogeneous populations, is we have minority populations growing up in urban areas that create delinquency. So delinquency is really, in my view, a sociological problem,
Right.
a cultural problem. The easiest solution for that is, of course, is to raise everyone's income, do away with slums, and make New York City look like Stockholm or something.
Yes, exactly.
We're not about to do that, so we have to deal
with
the
what
fact we have New York City, not Stockholm.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do we do that? And unfortunately, in juvenile court has never figured out a way to do that, because juvenile court has never really transcended the Mickey Rooney Boys Town model.
Right.
That the kids who commit crimes or have psychological issues, adjustment issues, and just need to be put back on the track again. Well, that's true with middle-class white kids, but it's not true of urban inner-city Black kids. But the good news is, and this is the irony, that even though inner-city Black kids make up a large predominance of the kids in juvenile court, and later on in adult court, because these same kids get older, so you got to say, if you don't solve the problem with the kid as a juvenile, he's going to come back when he's 21 or 22. And we've never dealt with the fact that that we need to tailor our solution to the cultural and sociological issues that we're facing. The good news is the kids that I see and saw in juvenile court, and that I saw later as young adults in criminal court, they're not bad kids. They're not psychologically disturbed. They don't need a psychiatrist. Most of the white kids that come into juvenile court do have psychological issues, and they are kind of loners and isolated, but the inner city kids that come are not there because they have psychological issues. They're there because they have sociological, cultural,
economic too.
Well, it has to do with the socialization process. My argument always has been that most of us, ideally, when I grew up, what kids, middle class kids generally, white kids in middle class neighborhoods generally, we're all socialized by family, neighborhood, school,
right,
family, neighborhood, school, and peer group, and church in some cases. So you've got 4 or 5 socializing agents that we all. When I was in high school, I got suspended once for smoking cigarettes. back in the late 1950s, and you know it had an impact on me because my parents were unhappy. The neighborhood knew that I was home during the day and not in school.
Yeah.
And my peer group were all in school, so I was kind of at home alone, feeling kind of bad. And so I wasn't in school. I didn't have a peer group. They weren't supporting me. My family in the neighborhood weren't supporting what I did. Now, when you're growing up in a housing project, and I spent years and years working in housing projects, um, for most kids who grow up in very low income areas, the family is probably not functioning the way a family might ideally be functioning. The problems, income problems, issues in the family. The neighborhood is a conglomerate of a lot of dysfunctional families where most of my delinquent kids grow up. And school is not a solution. School isn't working. My kids aren't going to school. That was the first most glaring thing that I saw in my kids is they weren't going to school. They didn't want to go to school. Partially, maybe it was the school's fault for not being relevant, but and the peer group wasn't going to school. So the kid who's not getting support from the family or from the neighborhood of families or from the school is left with that one key socializing agent, which is the peer group. So the peer group becomes all important to my kids, my inner city minority kids, and they hang out with a peer group,
Right.
and they become they do what the peer group does, and what the peer group does, unfortunately, is not socially acceptable. They shoplift, they go to the mall, they commit crimes, and it's not because they're individually so psychologically impacted or anything like that. It's because that's what the peer group does, and they're part of a peer group. Individually, they're fine and healthy,
Right.
and if you can address the peer group and change the negative peer group to a positive, then you can reach those kids.
Right. And all of the other support has left them. The only thing they've got really is the peer group.
Exactly. And so all they got is a peer group, and the good news is that they're not sick or nasty or bad. They just do bad things because the peer group does bad things.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the issue, and that's the problem. But the juvenile court would and what the solution I saw to that was to get kids in school, to create a positive environment, a positive school environment that the kid will want to go to or have to go to, because my job as a judge to force the kid to go to school,
Right.
to get back to school. When I saw that the schools weren't really working very well, I tried to start my own school. And for 20 years, I ran a school. It was called Troy Academy. It was an acronym, TROY, for Teaching and Rehabilitating Our Youth. And it was a school right next to the Juvenile Justice building. And as part of that, I started a restaurant called Teen Cuisine, where the kids worked in the restaurant, and the math class, instead of being a traditional math class, had to do with how do you make a
Change,
you
yeah.
know how much meat you put in a hamburger, and
Right.
how do you make a profit on a hamburger? How do you calculate profit and loss? And the kids got interested in that because they were being paid, they were making money, they were getting stipends for when they worked in the restaurant. They had to be in class 4 days a week and work in the restaurant 1 day a week. And we tried to make the classes relate to what was going on in the restaurant, and the kids, and it worked very well. And the kids who, when they're part of the large peer group in a classroom where they're hard to manage in a classroom, once they're working with just one or two other kids, and the chef supervisor who was teaching them how to make the hamburgers and sandwiches, the kids were wonderful.
Yeah.
Once they got away from that negative peer group and were doing something on their own, which they liked, and secondly generated some income, the kids were wonderful. And that works. It will work again and again with kids who have never had that experience of doing something positive that they like, and it's generating income for them and a certain amount of prestige because they like the idea. The restaurant was in the juvenile court building in the courtyard. So they were serving the cops that arrested them. They would serve, everybody was coming for lunch, and the kids were making the lunch. And our teen, it was a big food trailer, teen cuisine.
Right.
And the kids loved doing it, and made them feel good, and they were making money doing it, and they weren't going to commit other crimes as long as they were doing that, because it took them away from their negative peer group and gave them the chance to do something that they felt good about, and got the same gratification that they would have otherwise have been getting from shoplifting or something. So the good news is the kids were healthy. They didn't need psychologists, psychiatrists. But juvenile court is still not based on the idea that you had to deal with the peer group or educational deficits. And those are the two things that you need to deal with to counterbalance the influence of the negative peer group. The juvenile court is still based on the idea that it's a psychological issue. And you've got to see a psychiatrist, you've got to see a counselor. And there are those kids, relatively few minority, black or brown kids. Generally, the white kids who come from better income neighborhoods and families are there because they're isolates. One coincidence that I always point to is not so much a coincidence, I think, but very interesting, is that of all the multiple school shootings, and then we've had about 30 or 40 of them in the past 20 years. Not a single one has been an isolated black kid going into a school. Every one of them has been a psychologically troubled white or Anglo kid.
Yes, we've noticed that. Yes.
Which is an interesting phenomenon. That's what I saw in juvenile court, is the kids who come from middle class or better families, if they end up in juvenile court, they end up as individuals who did something while they were isolated from everybody else. My black inner city kids, who I consider healthy and love working with because they're healthy and because it's such a challenge, they don't do things like that. I mean, they don't do isolated things like that because they're part of a group which has its own problems, but it's not a psychological problem. It's a sociological, cultural issue that you got to deal with.
Right. And
it's hard to deal with it in a low-income housing project because, and the irony is that the isolated kids in that housing project were the overachievers in school because their mother kept them at home alone so they wouldn't go out and get caught up with the other kids who were part of a group that wasn't going to school. So the isolated kids in the housing project were being isolated by their mothers to keep them away from all those other kids.
And was it effective?
Well, for those isolated kids, yeah, because they didn't go out.
Yeah.
And I didn't see them in juvenile court. I mean, they didn't come to juvenile court because they did fine in school. Yeah. Because they had a parent, obviously. The parent comes into that because the parent kept the kid away from the other kids. But in most public housing projects, and I use housing projects as an example for a larger, very low income inner city population, is that the parents in most cases weren't paying that much attention or had that much control over what kids were doing, and usually the parents weren't aware of the fact in so many cases that the kid wasn't going to school. Because the kid just was hiding and was just going out and not going to school, and the parent was not going to the school to check on the kid, which may be partly the school's fault, partly the parent's fault, but it doesn't matter. The parent wasn't working. The parent supervision wasn't working, and the school attraction weren't working. Again, you're back to the peer group being the socializing factor in these kids' lives.
Yeah. One of the things we've noticed about, for instance, the Scandinavian countries, and I'm sorry to have to contrast the Scandinavian countries with a country as large and diverse as ours, but they make people pay back what they've taken. For instance, the young man who took the pizza. Now, if that young man was given the opportunity to pay back the money for the pizza that he stole, and maybe was watched a little bit more closely by a probation officer that he had to check in with occasionally. Do you think that if it was all kind of seen in terms of what if you take something from somebody, you have to give it back to them or repay it, would that be at all effective?
No, I don't. That's rehabilitative justice idea. Um, Again, it sounds good in principle, but
Right.
it wouldn't work for what I call my kids because number one, they don't have the money to pay back for the pizza, and number two, again, they just see this um, as a completely alien thing that they were being forced to do. I mean, they might do it, but I don't think it would have much of an impact. What would have an impact is if you teach the kid to make the pizza and give them a job at the pizza place.
Yeah,
That would work.
well, that would probably, yes, exactly. And I know that what you were trying to do was to kind of integrate that into some type of work experience for them, something that they would enjoy doing and learn from. And I guess it's not just paying back for the stolen pizza. That's not enough. You've got to get them on a track for either.
Yeah, you've got to make a major change
Exactly.
in what their priorities are. I
Yeah.
mean, they're the priorities of my delinquent kids. That's 60 or 70% of kids who come from low income inner city communities. Their priority is to be in sync with their peer group.
Right.
So
Right.
if they suddenly are paying back their meeting with the pizza person, it's not going to look cool to the peer group. The peer group is everything.
Yeah.
One of the things that I used to point out in juvenile court is that you'll never see an inner city kid with a substantial juvenile delinquency record wear glasses. Never see a kid with glasses. It was always a giveaway. If an inner city kid came into my court with glasses, I knew it was a first offender right off the bat.
Wow.
And in 20 years, I
Sure.
think I saw maybe one exception to that. But it's not because they have great eyesight. By delinquent kids, it's because if they wear glasses, their peer group is going to come down.
Yeah.
Just as if they take books home from school, their peer group is going to be critical of them, which is why they don't take books home from school. It's not. I mean, these kids are being. Their priority is the peer group because they don't have any other influence, the family, the neighborhood, or the school. So they give into the peer group and they don't take books home, and they don't go to school because if they go to school, the peer group is going to say, "Well, what are you doing that for?"
Yeah.
And to change that, you've got to have a school that will attract not just that one kid, but his peers as well. That they all have to buy into what the school is offering, and then you can change that behavior. Like working at Teen Cuisine, those kids wanted to work at Teen Cuisine, so they came to school because they could work at Teen Cuisine, and because we tried to change the curriculum to something that was interesting to them. Not the curriculum that had no relevance to them, which is a very difficult thing to do. You've got to change school's curriculum. You've got to give a high priority to school as being an important part of this process, and getting kids in school, not getting kids to a psychologist.
Right.
So when I got there, there was no kind of, and still there are no connection between the very little connection between the public education system and the juvenile court system. For example, the institutions that they send kids to don't have the halfway, they call them halfway houses, which are small residential programs. If they have teachers in there at all, there's no communication between the juvenile justice staff and the teachers. The teachers don't want to really be in there anyway for the most part, but there's no communication. One example that I always remember is one of the larger halfway houses had to close because it wasn't being successful, and it closed on a Monday, I guess. But the teachers all showed up because they hadn't heard in the weeks preceding it, even though everybody who worked in the halfway house knew it. The teachers who worked on this in a couple of the rooms in the halfway house, nobody told the teachers that the place was closing, which indicates how little communication there is between the juvenile justice staff and the teaching staff. And so the kids in those programs sit around and were sitting around watching television all day. I remember walking in and one day and into one of those halfway houses, and they were taking a vote on what television show to watch at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the people who ran the program were proud of the fact that they were doing this democratic vote thing about whether to watch, the view on, rather than emphasizing what's going on in the classroom. Why aren't these kids in a classroom? And if they're in a classroom, is that classroom relevant to them? And that's the problem, is getting kids in a school setting that is relevant to them. You've got I always said that there are three things you've got to do. You got to get the kid to go to school, to come into the classroom, and to sit down and to participate. And those are separate things. You can get the kid to go to the classroom, but to get him to sit down in the classroom rather than kind of distract, because the kid knows that, well, I'm not going to do well in here. And it's better for me and my friends sitting around here are going to like me more if I act like a wise guy in the classroom. And once the book comes to you in the round robin readings, and once you get the book and you can't read, it's easier to throw the book than it is to read out of the book. So that's why traditional classrooms just don't work with kids who haven't been going to school, who are way behind. The average reading level for my kids is my kids who are 15, 16, 17 years old, is fourth grade. I have very few kids who I saw coming to court for more than one offense. Kids who came back, who you call delinquent kids. It was very unusual to see a kid who had a reading level higher than fourth grade. Wow. And that's the problem. When you've got a 15-year-old reading at a fourth grade level, and you don't have a school or a program to send that kid to try to address that fourth grade reading level, and to interest the kid in staying in some kind of a classroom setting, he's going to go back out with his peer group who also are reading at a fourth grade level, and then they're going to commit other crimes together.
Yep, exactly. Tom, I hope that we will have another chance to talk about probation with you, because this is a topic that, your insights are amazing. And I just hope that some of the probation, especially the teen probation community, gets to hear your take and your ideas for maybe trying to improve the system. Next time, would we be able to talk about some of the ideas in the recesses of your mind that you think would actually make a real difference in the juvenile probation in the United States, at least? So, that would be fabulous. I want to thank.
We really haven't talked much about probation. We've talked about the overall
the evolution,
problem.
Exactly. But getting down to it, we'd love to talk again about this topic. This is a fascinating topic, and it's one of those areas that the United States has not been able to get a really good handle on. And people like you have ideas and information and insights to help with that. So thank you so much, Tom Petersen, Judge Tom Petersen, for being with us this morning. And it won't be too long that we will hopefully hear from you again.
Well, I'm happy to come back, and I enjoyed it very much, and it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.